I'm Gray Parks, your host today, and Vickie Lambert is our guest. And I remember seeing Vickie and her husband Clint in the hallway with their grandson, Hunter. And I saw them coming down the hallway, and I thought this was probably a couple visiting their folks, you know. But no, I saw their badge and realized they were residents. And you know, they both are fairly young when they came in. I just didn't really realize that they looked so young, you know. Anyway, Vickie, it's such a pleasure to have you today. We talked with Clint about a year ago or so, and I'm really delighted to talk with you because you have a background that's very interesting and exceptional, I would say. So let's start first about talking about your current family. We said Hunter was your grandson.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about Hunter and their parents and so on.
Well, we have one daughter, Lexi, son-in-law, Alan, and they live in Burke, and Hunter is their only child, and he is our only grandchild. In fact, he's the only grandchild on both sides of the family.
Oh.
We are a family of one child only policy, kind of like China. I'm an only child. Our daughter's an only child. Our son-in-law is an only child. Our son-in-law's father is an only child. And Clint has one sister, and Alan's mother has one brother. So when we get together, we can all cram into our minivan.
Yeah. so Thanksgiving dinner with everybody there is just not
we can all get at one table.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, so what do they do?
Our son-in-law is an aerospace engineer, and our daughter is a vice president at Specialty Graphics and Imaging Association.
Oh.
She plans conventions for 23 to 25,000 people.
Oh, is that right?
So she's extremely organized.
I'll
Yes.
bet.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what about your family, your original family, where you grew up? And tell us a little bit about your dad and mom, what they did, and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Hastings, Nebraska, so I lived predominantly between South Dakota and Nebraska. Spent most of my childhood living on a Yankton Sioux Indian reservation.
Oh, Lakota, the Sioux, huh?
The Sioux. I lived in a federally owned town called Pickstown. My father worked for the Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
And he was a powerhouse operator and was part of what was called the Pick-Sloan project that was developed in the 1940s. And they were building dams along the Missouri River for flood control and for creation of hydroelectric power.
Okay.
And so when they wanted to build this dam at Fort Randall, because historically there are still parts of the old fort that were there along the Missouri River, the people in the small towns that surrounded didn't want, as I told you earlier, the riffraff from the construction workers. So they didn't want any part of it. So the federal government said, fine, we'll build our own town, which they did. And it was kind of fascinating because historically at that point in time, the town was very progressive. We had the highest paid teachers in the state of South Dakota. In Pickstown. And we had probably some of the most modern housing for that point in time. And so it was a bit of an envy. When the town was at its peak, it was about 5,000 people. And we go back every 2 to 5 years for town reunions. There are about 167 people there now.
Is that right?
Not
How
much.
many show up at a reunion?
Probably about 150. And so anybody that went to school there, anybody that lived there, they're welcome to come back. So it's kind of interesting. We literally have people that live all over the U.S.
So, and of course that spans a period of how many years?
Probably about 20 years.
20. Oh, so you all knew each other. When you go back to the reunion,
we
you
know
each
most
other.
of the people, yes.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Now, what about this Sioux reservation?
Actually, the Sioux reservation, the land mass is quite large, and there are a lot of little towns that are occupied, you know, by Indians as well as non-Native Americans. And Pickstown just happens to be one of them. But what is kind of interesting is, right as I was leaving Pickstown and going on to college, they brought in the Air Force to create a radar site, and this was in the early 60s. And that did not last long, and so the federal government said, okay, well, it is Native American land, and we'll give that piece of land, we'll relinquish that. So the Native Sioux were smart. They built a casino, and now They're scalping the white man.
They're scalping the white man. Huh?
They're doing very well. They've increased the size of that casino probably 2 to 3 times in the past 20 years.
Is it, well, I would think we're talking about Nebraska, right?
No, we're talking South Dakota.
And this is close to the Black Hills, or?
No, it's on the other side of the state.
Yeah. On the.
It's all the way over,
yeah,
on the eastern side.
So this is okay. So. Did you have a lot of relations with the Indians, or was it purely just a matter you were living on?
I just basically lived on land that belonged to the reservation. Although when I was in high school, we would do sports with the Native Americans who were being schooled at what was called Mount Marty Mission, that was run by the Catholic Church.
Oh, okay.
So we did interact, but not extensively.
Now, you graduated. Well, did you do anything in high school that was an interesting stories or anything?
I used to water ski a lot, and I actually would water ski for photos to advertise Fort Randall Dam as a recreational site.
Well, how big was the dam?
It's pretty small now,
Yeah.
but by standards in the late 40s, it was the largest earthen dam in the U.S. But if you go to China, which Clint and I have because we've lived and taught there, they have like 28 spillways. Fort Randall has 6. So it's pretty small now, but at the time it was considered
6 spillways is a lot.
Yeah, it's...
So the lake that was behind it must have been a pretty good size.
It's very large, yeah.
6 miles, 10 miles?
Oh gosh, I have no idea how far up the river it actually goes, the reservoir itself.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So it was a great recreational.
And it still is. That's basically what takes place in the community, because there's not much left of the town. Most of the structures have been torn down. And what's interesting is when I first met Clint, he had actually heard of Pickstown because we have a church, and it still exists, that had a revolving altar. And so it was featured in Life magazine.
A revolving altar?
It was Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant.
Okay, okay.
And so it was to accommodate all the 3 faiths that were construction workers and also dam site workers that lived there.
About revolving, I was thinking it was in the center of a circular church and it just continued to rotate around, but that's not the way.
No, it's in the front of the church. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, I thought it was pretty creative at the time, but you know, they basically do not rotate the altar anymore. I mean, the church is probably, what, 65, 70 years old now.
Yeah. Well, you graduated from high school and you decided to become a nurse.
Yes.
Why did you pick
I had a great aunt who was a nurse and worked in a psychiatric facility, and I absolutely adored her. And I actually went back and became a nurse at the hospital where I was born.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you got initially your
my diploma.
Diploma, and that was from a.
It was from a hospital-based program, which were very, very prevalent in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, okay.
They've pretty much phased out in the U.S. now because we've pretty much moved nursing into university and college settings.
So then you went on to get your bachelor's.
I got my bachelor's at the University of Iowa.
Okay, now when did you meet Clint?
I met him at Case Western Reserve when I was getting my master's degree, and Clint was getting his 3rd undergraduate degree.
Oh.
So
you were getting your, but he was still getting in the bachelor's.
Right,
He was still in the bachelor's area. But the 3rd one, huh?
But the 3rd one, yes.
What were they in? I don't remember that.
Clint's background is in chemistry, anthropology, his double major, religion, and I'm trying to think of what the other one was. But he had gone pre-med and then changed his mind and decided to go into nursing. But that's where we met, and our daughter was born in Cleveland.
Oh, okay. And did you teach there?
I went back there probably 15 years later as associate dean.
Now, you have taught, and before you got your PhD, I presume.
Right, at the University.
Well, let's talk your PhD you got from the University of
California, San Francisco. And Clint was in the Navy at that time.
Oh, and stationed in the...
It's stationed in San Francisco, yes.
Okay, at the Naval Yard there? Or?
He was at the Naval Hospital.
Naval Hospital, okay.
Oak Knoll, I think.
Oak Knoll, that's the name of it. We went there when I was in Livermore. That was our hospital. And being a captain, although it was in the Army, made a big difference.
It doesn't hurt.
That's right. Oh, so Clint was at the hospital in Oakville, and you were,
I was in my PhD program at UCSF.
and you weren't teaching or anything. You were just
No, I was just a
full-time in
full-time
the
student.
PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. UC San Francisco is pretty much well specializes.
It's just all healthcare.
Yeah,
It's-
and so it's a big deal, I would think, to.
It was a great education, it really was. In fact, we laugh, we always say it was located on Mount Parnassus, which was the name of the street that ran right through the campus.
Parnassus, that's a good term. I won't talk about it. But anyway, so you got your PhD, and you had taught at schools before.
Yes, with a master's degree.
Yeah, and you were teaching nursing.
Right, I taught at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Taught at St. John College of Cleveland, and then we went to California and I got my PhD.
Yeah. So after you left California, where did you go from there?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Clint was in the Navy, and they decided he was going to go to the island of his choice, Japan.
Island where?
The island of his choice, Japan,
okay.
Japan,
Yeah.
or
Okay.
Japan.
Okay.
I didn't speak Japanese.
Yeah.
And so he was concerned that that would compromise my career. So he did what's called an inter-service transfer and went from the Navy to the Army, and we ended up in Augusta, Georgia.
Oh, so you didn't go to Japan at all?
Well, we did eventually,
Yeah.
but on our own terms. And
Okay.
at that point, they wanted you to be able to speak and teach in English, not Japanese.
Yeah. Okay, in Augusta, you became a teacher there and a professor there?
I was a professor there,
Yeah.
and from there we came to this area, to Washington, D.C. Clint was stationed at that
But you were in
point.
Augusta for a period of time?
4 years,
Oh, just 4 years?
just 4 years.
Now, did you become dean then, or did you go
No.
back? Okay,
I went back to become
all right,
dean,
so you
yeah.
you were taught there while Clint was in the Army down in
Right, Fort Gordon.
Fort Gordon, okay. Was he in the nursing at the hospital?
He was
there?
in psychiatric nursing.
Okay, so he's in psychiatric nursing, and you were in med
Med-surg,
Okay.
right.
All right, so from Augusta, you went.
We came to Washington, D.C. Clint was stationed at Walter Reed, and I taught at George Mason
Oh,
and helped set up their PhD program.
so it's kind of interesting. Clint went when he was in the service. He went to, and you were able to teach in the schools and facilities. Right?
I was very fortunate because all of his duty stations worked out fine for me, which
Yeah.
is really nice.
Yeah. That is interesting because that doesn't often happen.
No, frequently it doesn't, except for when he was supposed to go to Japan.
Well, that might have worked out too. If you know, who knows?
It's possible.
Yeah.
We didn't want to run the risk.
Yes, I understand that. Yeah. All right. So now you're up here. What happens next?
Well, I taught at George Mason, and then I was recruited to come to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And Clint had retired at that point from the military and
Okay.
was in private practice. So we went to Cleveland. Our daughter started college at Case Western, and then I was recruited back to Georgia to become their dean at the Medical College of Georgia School of Nursing. And our daughter then transferred from Case Western to Florida State, which is where her dad has 2 of his undergraduate degrees.
And you became then the professor and dean of nursing at
Right, for 10 and a half years.
10 and a half years. And what did Clint do in the meantime?
He had his own private practice in
Okay.
rural Georgia.
So you retired then from Augusta.
Yes, from my
And
American job, yes.
Okay, and joined Clint in his business, is that?
No, what we did when I retired, he sold his practice, and one of our colleagues, who at the time was Dean of Nursing at the University of Virginia, said, I have a colleague in Japan that really wants somebody to come teach psychiatric nursing because they have no idea what the concept is.
Oh.
And so I came back from a conference that Clint went with me, and it was one of my dean's conferences, and we knew we were retiring, and I said, I found a job for you. Just be aware it's in Japan.
So both of you went to Japan.
We both went to Japan.
And did you have a job there?
I had a job too. They created a position for me.
Okay.
And Clint taught psych and I taught theory. And we were editors of their journal, which was the first English language professional nursing journal in Asia at that time.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So we had a great time there. We actually lived and taught there for 2 years.
Were you in Tokyo?
No, we were in Ube, which is on the southern tip of Honshu.
Okay. That was a pretty nice place, wasn't it?
It was nice. Yeah, it was about 75,000, the size of Ube, and
you're near the coast, I presume.
Yeah, it's on the coast. It's
Yeah.
right. In fact, we used to go out and watch the fishing ships go out.
Yep.
We probably had the best seafood in all of Japan because we got it from the inland sea and the Sea of Japan. So we had great sushi was wonderful. So I never thought I'd eat raw fish, but you know, I like.
But you did.
Oh, I love sashimi.
And I did too.
Yeah.
I was stationed up in Sendai, which is up north of
Yes,
Tokyo, about
yes.
a couple hundred miles, and which had this big tsunami that came in. Well, anyway, let's talk about. So how long did you stay?
We were there for 2 years,
Okay.
and then we had met a colleague in Japan who was an American who was stationed in Japan, and she had been in China under Project Hope. And we became very good friends with Marcia. We came back to the States. We spent then 8 months teaching at the medical center in Arkansas, University of Arkansas. And Marcia contacted us and said, would you like to come and help me set up a nursing program at the master's level that's built off of the American model for teaching nursing?
In China.
In China.
Yeah.
And so for 5 years, we spent 3 months a year teaching in China.
Oh,
and
is that
setting
5
up-
years you did
We
that?
did that for 5 years.
Boy. So,
And then in the process, we met a lot of colleagues from South Korea, Thailand. We did a lot of trips back to the States to Hawaii, which is very, and we met people from Finland. So we did some international research. And so we have, probably 5 or 6 articles looking at coping of hospital-based nurses in Japan, Thailand, South Korea, Hawaii, because it's very Asian. We ended up looking at the same thing in China and Australia and New Zealand. And so we met colleagues in all these different countries of all of our trips back and forth to Hawaii.
did you live in Hawaii? Did you base yourself out of Hawaii, or did you?
No, when we were in China, we based ourselves out of the U.S.
Oh, okay.
We were living in Odenton, Maryland at the time.
Okay.
But we also then met a lot of people from Thailand. So then we spent 5 years, 3 months a year, teaching master's and PhD students in Thailand. And then on the side, we spent a month teaching in Finland, a month teaching in South Korea, for about 4 or 5 years, 2 weeks every other year, teaching and consulting in Australia. And we ended up teaching for a month in Jordan.
So you were sort of guest professors, I presume, at these colleges. Now, let's go back to Japan. You set up the school in Japan.
We helped Marcia set up the school.
And you helped set up the school in China, I presume.
Yes. Well, the school in Japan was actually already set up.
Was it? Okay.
But they wanted psychiatric nursing, which is why they wanted Clint.
Yeah.
And then I taught some of the other courses. And we always taught in English. But what's interesting, Japan was the only country where we had translators and interpreters. The others, we just spoke in English. And the people who came to those programs in China and Thailand, Finland, South Korea, they had to be able to speak and understand English. But the Japanese had probably the poorest English of all the countries we taught in.
Well, I've been there.
Which we were amazed. We thought it would have been the best.
Yeah, I would have thought it would be just the other way around.
But we both had a translator. My translator was actually educated at the master's level at Villanova University, and Clint's was educated in Australia at the master's level. Clint's translator, we helped get into the PhD program in Hawaii, and she now is back teaching in Japan.
Yeah. But very interesting. Now, so it interests me the fact that you were able to establish teaching 1 month or 3 months or whatever in these different countries as visiting professors. But this, Marcia, did you say Marcia?
Marcia helped us get started, and we were under Project Hope when we were in China.
Yeah.
But we were totally independent private agents in Thailand and in Finland, in Jordan, in South Korea. That was all negotiations that Clint and I did on our own as we met colleagues from those countries at conferences.
Well, Finland is such a different,
Oh, yes.
compared to the Asian part.
We went to Finland in March.
Yeah. Well, that's not a good time to do that.
Well, they told us, it's the beginning of spring and it's warming up.
Yeah.
It was 30 below when we arrived, and they had a heat wave as we flew out a month later, and it was 29 below. I have never been so cold in my life. And as we're sitting in the plane, getting ready to land in Finland, I said to Clint, "Does this plane have heat?" Because we could see the breath of the stewardess as she was coming down the aisle, giving us coffee that was steaming. But it's very cold there. In fact, we drove north of the Arctic Circle to Santa Claus Village. Yeah.
I spent a few days on a ship in Norway in April. April 22nd, we left Bergen, and we traveled north of the Arctic Circle over to Kirkenes and back in about 10, 12 days. And so we spent about 10 days north of the Arctic Circle. But we were out in the Gulf Stream.
Oh.
The Gulf Stream goes up the coast of Norway. And you know, it was beautiful. I just couldn't believe how much we lucked out. The weather, the temperature was fine. So that's contrast to inland,
yes,
a couple of 100 miles.
Yeah, the thing that fascinated us too was their reindeer husbandry that they have. They ate a lot of reindeer meat, which actually is very, very healthy because it's like buffalo. It's not real fatty.
Yeah.
But because they don't have a lot of fruits and vegetables, fresh ones at that time of year, it was kind of, our food was basically limited to probably 50 different kinds of bread, reindeer meat, mashed potatoes, and a lot of canned vegetables. So it was a little limited, but then, you know, I mean, they just didn't have access. A lot of good cheese, though.
A lot of good cheese, huh? Good. Well, I found Finland to be a fairly interesting country, too. And I presume that you did compare, you know.
We taught students from the Netherlands. They had an international program there, and so we looked at healthcare. What we taught was comparing and contrasting healthcare systems across countries, and we had a number of students from the Netherlands, which was fascinating.
Yeah. Now, your research, you've done a lot of research in these same countries, and maybe a couple of others too, but in these, what kind of research are you doing?
Well, we sort of melded Clint's background in psych and my background in medical surgical nursing, and we looked at stress and coping, which is what I focused on in my PhD program, and that's what I did my dissertation on. So we looked at how
Would you describe that just a little bit?
Well, we looked at what in the hospital setting stresses nurses, and then what mechanisms do they use to cope with those stressors. And what was fascinating, regardless of culture, the top 3 stressors were the same.
Oh, is that right?
Workload, dealing with death and dying, and I can't remember what the third one was off the top of my head, but basically what stressed the nurses regardless of culture was the same. And the 2 that fascinated us were workload and dealing with death and dying. Now, how they coped, that was very different.
Oh, is that right?
Because Asians will cope much differently than the nurses in Hawaii who are influenced by Western culture. They would cope much differently.
How can you explain some of
the Asian culture more likely would try to idealize or fantasize how to deal with the coping, whereas people from Western cultures tend to confront it more readily, face on, and try to fix it. They would use a lot more emotional type of ways to try and cope with the stressors.
Has this research led to some books, or?
Well, we did our books before we did that research. We did 5 textbooks.
5 textbooks.
2 of them we wrote ourselves. In fact, I was afraid you were going to ask me, and I can't remember the titles. I'm getting old. The first one we did, which was published in 1979, was The Impact of Physical Illness and Related Mental Health Concepts. So again, merging Clint's background and my background. The next one was published in 1985, which was Psychosocial Care of the Physically Ill, What Every Nurse Should Know. And then we did a 3rd one and a 4th one in 1989 when I was at George Mason, and it was Perspectives in Nursing, the Impacts on the Nurse, the Consumer, and Society, and then we did the Instructor's Manual that went with that, which was a separate book. And then when we did our international travels, we edited actually a book with our colleagues from Australia, and they had approached us and said, would you work with us on this? We've done this type of textbook for Australians, but we'd like to do one for Americans. And that book was Professional Nursing, Concepts, Issues, and Challenges.
Now, these are used in classrooms now, I presume, around the...
Well, probably not anymore. The 2005 one maybe, but the others are so old they're out of print.
I noticed one on Amazon.
Oh, really?
$59.
Seriously?
Yeah. I think they only had a couple left. And they had some used ones, though, that were $5 or $6.
That's interesting, because when we taught in Thailand, a number of the faculty came to us and said they had used our first 2 textbooks, and that's how they knew who we were. But they pretty much are, because of their age, they're out of print.
Yeah.
They make good paperweights now.
Well, but you know, when you get into these are books about specific things in the nursing or the
Yes.
and
yes.
so they don't change. Well, there are changes, but I would think, have you considered editing them and updating them, or can you do that?
Well, our first 2 books were actually, we were approached by Springer. It wasn't Springer, it was Appleton, Century, and Croft. And we worked with a publisher. In fact, we worked with publishers on all of our books.
Yeah.
But you would have to write a prospectus and tell them what you wanted to do. Yeah. And we've sort of given up writing, because after we were editors in Japan, we were also editors for 5 years in Thailand for 2 of their nursing research journals, and we helped the PhD students rewrite in English, in correct English, their research findings to be published, because in Thailand you can complete a dissertation, but if it's not published in an English language journal, they won't grant you your PhD.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Oh.
They're very rigorous.
Okay.
And so we spent 5 years helping PhD students get their things published in English.
Well, that's you know, you've had a fascinating career, and it really is fascinating. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's been fun.
I bet it, well, I
Tiring at times.
I understand that. You know, it's really fun to be able to do all of these different things, and I'm sure you feel a great sense of accomplishment, both of you.
Well, what has been nice is that Clint and I basically have carried out our careers somewhat in parallel, but also together, and that's unusual, particularly in nursing.
I would think so.
For both of us to be in nursing, but on different aspects of nursing. Clint was very clinical. I was very academic.
Mm-hmm. Well, Vickie, I sure appreciate you coming on Who's Who today, and I hope the people of Green Spring have learned a little bit about nursing and you, and I've learned a lot about your career. I just think that's a wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful career. So that's
now
great.
my career is our grandson, and it's Clint's career too.
And he's about 4 years old.
He's 4 years old.
Well,
yes.
You've got a long career ahead of you.
Yes, and I find after he's been with us for a while, I'm very tired for a couple days.
I'm not surprised. I went through grandkids. We used to have what was called Camp Mosquito, and we had our grandkids up from Richmond, and we would have a little camp every summer for them, and for a week. And we would do all of these different things that they didn't get to do. And I have a daughter who was instrumental, and we essentially let her manage it after a couple of years. So the Camp Mosquito was just for them, but when they went home and talked about it, their other friends, wanted to come to Camp Mosquito.
Oh, that's neat.
Well, that's all we have time for today.